We're ready to start the last panel. I'm going to call up Robin Bartram, who is going to moderate this panel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking around for... Oh. Thanks, Carlos. Thank you for sticking around for the last panel of the day. I'm not going to say very much, except that I'm really excited to hear from all three of our panelists, who are going to be talking about and centering policy solutions at the intersecting crises of housing and the climate. So let me just get straight into introductions. First of all, we will be hearing from Danielle Arigoni, who is an urban planner and community resilience expert. She currently serves as Managing Director for Policy and Solutions at National Housing Trust, where she leads their efforts to bring climate investments to bear on the task of preserving affordable housing. She's also author of Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation, which explores the impacts of climate change on a rapidly growing demographic, people over 65. And here is that very book, and the need for community-scale solutions to reduce risk for all. So prior to joining NHT, Danielle held several leadership positions. She holds planning degrees from Cornell University, the University of Oregon, and serves as a board member for the League of American Bicyclists and Smart Growth America. So please join me in welcoming Danielle.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to everyone for sticking around late in the day here. We know it's a long day, lots of good information, and we want to contribute to that conversation. We decided amongst ourselves to take a little bit of a different approach as a panel. So we each have sort of 3 questions that we'll be answering in the course of our talks. One is kind of what is the challenge that we specifically are undertaking for this panel? 2, how did we get here? A little bit of evoking what we heard earlier in the day from Vivek and Carlos. And then 3, what are some possible policy solutions? So that's kind of what the architecture of what you'll hear over the course of our conversations. And I want to, again, sort of center back in this notion of dueling crises. I'm going to focus specifically on the challenge that I want to talk about, which is this challenge that we face between our growing climate risks, which we've covered well today. We know we're very well acquainted with at this point, and one that we haven't really talked about so much, which is our demographic changes that are underway. We know that we are aging rapidly as a country. In fact, by 2034, we'll be a country of more older adults than people under 18. For the first time ever, older adults are actually our fastest growing demographic in the US. And each year that demographic grows increasingly diverse, linguistically, racially. We're actually entering peak 65. It's a term of art in the aging world, with 4 million people over 65 coming online every year now through 2027. So each of these sort of dueling challenges, if you will, climate risks has its own set of challenges associated with it, its own set of professions working on it. Similarly, so is the challenge of preparing for an older, grayer future. And when you layer on top of that, of course, the housing challenges that we've talked about all throughout the course of the day, we really actually have this kind of trifecta of challenges that we're confronted to address, to rise up and meet the challenge of, each of which really, frankly, has its own sort of distinct set of professionals working on it. That's a problem in and of itself. There is a siloization, you've heard this before, in how we respond to each of these challenges, and therefore there's kind of a lack of awareness of where these challenges intersect and actually magnify risk. And I would put forward the notion that climate change is in fact having an extreme effect, a disproportionate effect on older adults, and that is a problem because we are, again, our communities are home to a growing share of them. Part of the reason that we're here, sort of how we got here, is the fact that we really generally don't talk about aging in our country. It's not part of the public discourse very often. It's often sort of handled as a private, confidential matter that you deal with in your own family or as an individual. But the reality is, and because of that, there are a lot of sort of misconceptions and preconceptions about what it means to age. There's a huge amount of diversity within the older adult cohort, of course, but there are some truths I think that are important to kind of lay out as a way of grounding our understanding as we begin to rise to these challenges of talking about climate change, of tackling our housing crisis. A lot of misconceptions. As I said, the reality is that about 1 in 6 older adults either live near or below the poverty line. A huge amount of them live independently in the community. They do not live in congregate facilities, as tends to be the presumption. And of those, about 30% live alone. 1 in 5 don't drive. A very high number of them live with dementia or Alzheimer's disease. A good number have ambulatory limitations, have difficulty getting around, and 80% have 2 or more chronic medical conditions that they're living with at any given time. And many of these directly implicate and exacerbate climate-fueled risk. When you think about illnesses like heart disease or hypertension, or respiratory challenges like COPD that many older adults are dealing with, not to mention the challenge of isolation. We heard about that a little bit from Vivek today. What isolation means in terms of how you react to climate stressors has a direct effect on your risk and your viability in the face of those stressors. Part of that is why we see that older adults are very much disproportionately impacted by climate change. And going back to disasters as far back as the 95 heat wave here in Chicago, through to Katrina, through to name your disaster, up until very recently, older adults are dying at twice, 3 times, even 4 times the rate of the rest of the population. And that's certainly the case for heat-fueled disasters. Again, we heard about that today. And we saw evidence of that in the Pacific Northwest, where when you have these massive heat waves, which again are not characterized as disasters, as we heard, we see that older adults are dying at a much higher rate. 80% of the 12,000 deaths attributable to heat each year are among older adults. So again, I think that's ample evidence, if you needed it, that older adults are really disproportionately impacted by climate change. And as we think about communities and preparing for what climate change is bringing us, we need to prepare for the fact that communities are comprised of a larger and larger share every year of older adults. Part of that then becomes how we think about housing. How does housing fit into that? It's both a contributing factor, right? It protects from risk if it's done well, but it can also strain the ability of older adults to prepare for risk and to mitigate their own risk. A lot of the reason that older adults kind of lack the financial ability to undertake those resilience investments that we heard about earlier is because they're barely scraping by when it comes to their ability to remain stably housed. The Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard reported last year that we were at a record high in terms of older adults being housing cost constrained, experiencing housing cost burden. So more than one out of every 2 older renters is housing cost burdened. 1 in 4 older homeowners is as well. These are sort of foundational conditions that make it very difficult for older adults to undertake any additional expenditures that might reduce their risk or frankly get them out of harm's way. A big part of why this housing cost burden is increasing is in fact attributable to the cost of utilities and insurance, as we've heard a little bit of talk today. 10 million households right now that are headed by someone 60 or over report that they're energy insecure. And about 7 million households report that they had to undergo or had to go without food or medicine in order to pay their utility bills. That means that someone suffering in a home or an apartment that's either too hot or too cold for their comfort has to make real trade-offs between how much they can withstand and how much they can afford. Flood and wildfire insurance premiums, again, we've started to talk about that, are increasing as FEMA is developing more data-informed risk projections. FEMA is phasing in those challenges, capping them at 18% per year, but that still means that a homeowner in Louisiana, for example, is going to see their flood insurance rates go from $800 a year to over $5,000. These are not costs that older adults and anyone on low income or fixed incomes can easily bear. So in the course of writing this book that was mentioned, it became clear that there were solutions needed across an array of sectors. This is not just a housing problem, certainly not, as Vivek mentioned, just an emergency management problem. It really transcends so many sectors: housing, transportation, utilities, health, and much more. And there are some key takeaways I think can inform reactions and policy responses across all of those sectors. First, it really becomes critically important that we acknowledge and frankly concede that climate change is impacting older adults and it's impacting them differently. That begins by imagining, for example, what it means for a 62-year-old or 65-year-old who's financially secure, healthy and engaged. What are they experiencing as compared to an 89-year-old, for example, who may be living alone in substandard housing with chronic medical conditions and no savings? Or a grandparent who lives comfortably in an intergenerational home with her child and her family, compared to someone who lives alone or is caretaking for a spouse with dementia, or it lives in a home that is substandard, again, no financial resources. There's a huge amount of variety within the older adult cohort, and older adults are more racially, linguistically, and ethnically diverse every single year. When you layer on top of these realities, their financial realities, their housing stability realities, their caregiving responsibilities, you have to kind of understand that problem set, as it were, in order to understand what climate risk means for those households. Second, we have to acknowledge that individual and institutional preparedness is not enough. One conclusion that I reached from doing the research is that the people who died are not often, it wasn't often a result of them being unprepared. It was a result of us having unrealistic expectations of what it means to be prepared for someone who lives on a fixed income, or who cares for a homebound family member, or who can't drive. They're also the result of systems-wide failures that impact the whole community, but especially older adults, and therefore need to be dealt with at the community scale. Finally, for these reasons and more, it's why we really need to lean into building community resilience. That means that all sectors and all disciplines have a role to play: emergency managers, housing providers, transportation planners, and more. It's no longer a job for any one sector. It's a job for every sector. Moreover, I believe it's sort of the job for all of us in whatever sector we happen to sit in. After all, we all have older adults whom we love. We all hope and aspire to age ourselves in communities that will be safe and secure in the face of a changing climate, but we're not on the path at the moment to create communities that are resilient in that way. And if all that is just too much to remember, the too long didn't read takeaway here is, when you're thinking about policy solutions regardless of sector, ask and answer the question, does it reduce risk for older adults in the face of climate change? If it does, you're probably on to something. You're probably on to benefits or solutions that benefit other people in community. If you're not, time to go back, because you're failing to implement a solution that's gonna work for all. So very quickly, there's a lot of housing takeaways and zoning and building code solutions that we could talk about in terms of what's working, who's doing this well. I would say there's no one place that's doing this perfectly, but New Orleans has been mentioned a couple times today. They certainly are really on the front lines of this battle here in the US particularly. They have undertaken a lot of efforts as they've sort of evolved in the last couple decades in how they respond to disaster and climate-fueled disaster specifically. They're one of 3 case studies that I cover in the book. And I won't go into the sort of building code and building standard and zoning reforms that they undertook, because I want to focus on an example of community resilience. I think that they illustrate really beautifully. It started really with this notion of older adults and their vulnerability in the face of what is now commonly understood to be the greater risk in New Orleans. Once upon a time, their emergency response or disaster response was to evacuate, to get people out of harm's way. They realized that that was not a sustainable model, didn't work for a lot of people, frankly, added more risk for many older adults. They pivoted instead to a response approach or protocol that enabled people to shelter in place. Not just shelter in place for a day or two, but to shelter in place for weeks on end, particularly with extended power outages. And power outages are growing, becoming more frequent, pose particular risk for older adults who rely on in-home medical equipment. And because of that, they were able to sort of hone in on a few different solutions, learning from past failures, frankly, and implement a few policy solutions that I think can be instructive. So one, after seeing what happened in Hurricane Ida in 2021, where older adults living in multifamily buildings with multiple stories, the power went out. There were no backup requirements for these property owners. These were not subsidized homes. This was just market rate homes where many adults, older adults happen to live. They were not required to have backup power. As a result, there was one particular story where 8 older adults died because they became effectively trapped in their apartments because the elevators no longer worked. They couldn't navigate the stairs. They were unable to get to safety. They were unable to get adequate cooling. So in response, the city implemented a new policy that requires backup power in properties, privately owned properties, that tend to serve more than a few, I think the number is 8, older adults in the property. That's one. So 2, Another example of response that they've kind of deployed was this idea of how can we get renewable energy power out to people where they are? So they have a whole series of sort of mobile renewable energy mechanisms to get portable power sources out into the community to at least enable some sort of short-term relief, short-term service of people. But the example that I think is most powerful is the example of a group called Together New Orleans, which implemented the Community Lighthouse and is implementing the Community Lighthouse solution. You see one here in the picture. This is the Broadmoor Community Lighthouse in New Orleans. It happens to be housed in a church, but there are other resilience hubs like this that are located in health centers or other sort of quasi-public facing institutions. This community-based organization secured funding, implemented renewable energy on a public facility, got the backup storage that was needed, created this mechanism of both supporting the community residents through on-site power as well as food and water and basic necessities. But it wasn't just that. They didn't just stop at the building scale. They actually coupled that with sort of a door-to-door network of volunteers and staff who made it their job on a routine basis to go out and knock on every door in the zone that they were responsible for, the area, the district that this hub was meant to cover and serve. The reason they did that is because that was how they became acquainted with the needs of older adults ahead of time. They understood that Mrs. Johnson, who lives around the corner, if you haven't heard from her in a couple hours or, a day or so, you need to go knock on her door because her family lives, a few states away and isn't there to help her. Or maybe she's got an oxygen machine that will require more urgent attention, more urgent support, get her to the resilience hub sooner. But that sort of community-facing service alongside the building and the physical infrastructure of resilience, it's what's making this model work. And I think it's a great example of sort of community resilience approach that really wraps around the sort of building code and zoning housing-related solutions that I think we'll hear about from our other panelists. So thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. I think you left your phone here. Oh, okay. I'll leave it right here for you. So next up, we will be hearing from Marla Nelson, PhD AICP, who is a professor of planning and urban studies at the University of New Orleans, where she directs the Master of Urban and Regional Planning program and serves as faculty associate with UNO Center for Hazards Assessment, Response, and Technology. She has published widely on the impacts of and responses to industrial and occupational restructuring in US cities and regions, human capital and interregional migration, and post-disaster recovery and redevelopment. Her recent research focuses on migration as a critical site of climate action and examines how planning and policy can facilitate more just outcomes for residents and communities on the front line of climate and environmental change. She received her BA in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and her MCRP and PhD in urban planning and policy development from Rutgers. So please join me in welcoming Marla.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Emily, and to the conference committee for inviting me here today. I must say the panels have been fantastic. My talk today takes a bit of a different focus. I'm looking at relocation as a climate adaptation strategy. And this draws on my work over the past several years in coastal communities in Louisiana, not too far from New Orleans, but at the same time, worlds away. And trying to understand how people in some of the most vulnerable places in the United States are making decisions about how to adapt in place or whether or not to move. And my work in this area started a few years back when, as a result of our coastal master planning process, the state wanted to get more involved with buyouts and relocating people. And we'd gotten really good with understanding which communities and which structures were most at threat, right? So we could identify the places for relocation policies, but knew really little about how people were making decisions and what people needed if they were considering relocating to make them whole. So that's what I'll talk about today. All right. So what we can see, talking about migration is an extremely complex topic. We all understand that. People move for a variety of economic, social, political, and increasingly environmental reasons. But we know that climate stressors are increasingly becoming more important drivers of migration behavior. Right? We have an increase in in billion-dollar disasters with these sudden events, but increasingly we see that slow onset stressors are impacting people's ability to stay in their communities, making some places less desirable to live in. And we know that this is something we hear a lot about in the popular press about how this is going to change migration patterns in the United States. And in Louisiana, we can already see these population shifts occurring. The image that I have up here is from our most recent coastal master plan. It shows that without any action for major coastal restoration projects, the state of Louisiana will lose 3,000 square miles of land in 50 years, changing the landscape of the southern part of the state. Whole communities will be gone, and this area is the front line of hurricane protection for more inland communities like New Orleans. And as a result of these environmental changes we're facing, we've seen pretty dramatic population shifts in recent years. The state of Louisiana has been losing population. This isn't only due to climate threats. I mean, we have a weak economy. People, as I said, are moving for many reasons. But we can also see a shift within the state of where people are moving. And people are increasingly moving inland up from the coast. And while this is something that's really gone on for generations in Louisiana, these patterns have been accelerating. And in some of these coastal parishes or counties, these are among the areas that are losing population fastest within the United States. And so with this in mind, I want to frame my comments today by saying that we really need more transformative climate relocation assistance if we're going to be able to handle this problem that we're facing, not just in Louisiana, but that we're going to be facing nationally. And right now, we've got a number of existing programs, primarily through FEMA, through HUD CDBG funds, that help people relocate. Most of them are voluntary. And these programs have been widely popular, particularly growing since the 90s and 2000s. But there's a tremendous amount of limitations that hinder participation in them, particularly for low and moderate income populations. As Carlos mentioned before, the first one that I'll mention today is that, how these programs are structured. And they're following a disaster recovery model, funding in response to a particular disaster. People are given a short window of time to decide at a very traumatic point in their lives after having experienced a disaster whether or not to participate in a relocation program. And the funding isn't continuously available. So not only does this create a really constrained decision-making environment, but it's really misaligned with how people make adaptation decisions. And this is something that became really clear in doing my work. People don't just decide to move or decide to stay. It isn't this single decision made at a particular point in time. But when we think about how people adapt, we need to understand that it's a dynamic, ongoing process. And people make multiple adaptation decisions over time. There's limited access to these programs. Certainly with the mitigation programs, it requires that you participate in the flood insurance program. We've heard all day about how expensive it is. In many of these coastal communities, people don't have insurance, right? I mean, the costs are so prohibitive that they're foregoing it automatically. And that keeps a large segment of these populations from being able to access aid. also, and this is something else that Carlos mentioned, participation in relocation programs often requires proof of land ownership. So we have to think about who that doesn't include. Mobile homeowners who don't own the land underneath their properties, and those who lack clear title to their property. And this is a really unseen problem, under-acknowledged problem in the United States. After Hurricane Katrina, there were 25,000 households in the city of New Orleans alone who were ineligible for federal recovery and relocation assistance because they didn't have clear title. So it's 14% of applicants for the program. When resources are available, they're insufficient, right? They're based on fair market value. Again, as we heard today, I mean, property values are very depressed in high-risk areas, so people don't have the resources to move and find comparable housing in safer locations. So what happens? People can get stuck in place in these really risky areas, or if they do move, tend to move to another location that really doesn't make them any better off from a climate perspective. There's a tremendous amount of confusion and mistrust about policies to foster relocation. And this is based in, histories of oppression and discrimination and real concerns of, oh, people want to the government wants to take my property. They're going to use it to, give it to an individual for development or to oil and gas industries. And finally, the last limitation that I'll mention is that we know really little about the effectiveness of these programs. We can talk about the amount of money we spent on buyouts, we can talk about the number of properties that were bought out, but we know very little about how the individuals who relocated fared. And if we want to, thinking about these challenges that are ahead, we need to do a much better job of understanding what we're doing well and what we're doing poorly. So I just want to, that got cut off a little bit, talk about what are the key tenets of moving towards a transformative relocation assistance program. And first and foremost, this idea that we need to center people in communities. And with too much of our relocation programs, the focus has been on reducing property damage and reducing the burden on government insurance programs. These are important, but we also need to focus on individual and community well-being, and to what extent are we really creating viable options for people to move out of harm's way and make their lives better. And this requires community-defined adaptation pathways. All too often, we can have local officials and planners come into a community and say, okay, here's a program to take advantage of. We want to buy you out, without an understanding of where the community is in their thinking about relocation, and also the varying circumstances or opportunities that they're facing. And when we are thinking about relocation assistance, it really needs to reflect resident needs and priorities. Assistance needs to be flexible and ongoing, right? Not just after a disaster, not just with an annual funding program, but assistance available for communities when they need it. And resources need to be sufficient, meaning that people can actually find suitable replacement housing. This is a key challenge, as we all know, with the lack of affordable housing, particularly in lower risk areas. But when we think about assistance, we also need to think beyond just monetary assistance, but other assistance that communities may need, moving assistance or whatnot. And all of this is really premised on ongoing dialogue and planning with communities. I was really struck by the lunchtime speaker. I thought the session was fantastic. And he said, what, if we were to do it all again, really having an understanding of the community needs, right? To have those community needs and priorities lead before the technology. And I think that that's just wise wisdom for any adaptation-related policy, and really premised on ongoing dialogue with communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Marla. And last but definitely by no means least, we will be hearing from Katharine Burgess. So Katharine is the Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America, where she oversees their land use programs, including LOCUS, the Form-Based Codes Institute, and the National Brownfields Coalition. An urban planner, Katharine has 15 years of experience practicing in the US, the UK, and Germany. Her research work has included landscape performance research for the Landscape Architecture Foundation, as well as international urban policy research for the Robert Bosch Foundation Fellowship Program. She holds an MSc in Regional and Urban Planning from the LSE, London School of Economics, and a BA from Williams College. So please join me in welcoming Katharine.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. This has been such an incredible day with so much to think about, and our panel strategized beforehand about how we could try to pull it all together, so I feel really lucky to be up here at the tail end to try to draw on a lot of the themes from today. So I'm here from Smart Growth America. We're a national nonprofit, and our North Star is a country where no matter who you are or where you live, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. I think that preparedness for climate impacts absolutely has to be a key part of that equation, because how can a household be healthy, prepared for what comes before you, and live in a vibrant, exciting, and a high opportunity community when you're at risk from all of the hazards that we have seen today: floods, fires, heat. It's really terrifying when you start thinking too much about what it all actually looks like. Dana started us off today mentioning this was a full circle moment for her, so I think I'll do the same from the beginning to almost the end of the day. I want to thank Emily for the invitation, especially because we met almost 20 years ago when I was an early career planner doing my first really intensive work post-Katrina. And that work, that time which Carlos introduced in his overview of climate events in the US, it obviously left a huge impression on me. Seeing the extent of loss, the overlay of racist housing and land use policy with vulnerability to climate impacts, and the really dysfunctional government response, as well as the multiple, often unsuccessful approaches to community engagement, really motivated me to try to work in policy to try to make things better. We obviously have a long way to continue to go, but one positive is when I think back on those times, I can't think about climate change coming up ever in any of the public meetings, or frankly, in any of our team sessions either. It wasn't something that the housing community was really talking about. Yes, green design, yes, walkability, reducing reliance on cars, higher quality of life, but climate change wasn't explicitly a focus of a lot of the dialogue then, and I'm glad to know that we're all working together to change that. So looking at, as we all strategize the panel thinking about positioning what we see as the challenge, I think this ties together a lot of what we've heard about throughout the day. First, we're in the midst of a housing access crisis. Housing is desperately needed. It's difficult to build in this country on account of discriminatory land use policy, lending, finance, NIMBYism, a whole host of issues. And we do not have enough housing, and yet growth is happening, and that's needed growth in many areas which are really at high risk of climate impacts, which Marla talked us through in her session just now. As you look at, especially the historic fabric of cities, racist urban planning policy has put communities of color and low-income communities in harm's way and compounds those harmful climate impacts. And then, as we heard from Jesse, there's also an increasingly sophisticated market and financial sector awareness of climate risk, which is really compounding those inequities given the gap between that market awareness and awareness of homeowners, renters, and local governments. And then finally, there's indications, and it's already happening, of migration and additional growth pressures. And I think for many of the communities which have had, press conferences about how they are climate havens, economic development, come here, whether that is Duluth or Buffalo or, the sort of headline of the day from the mayors and the directors of sustainability, these locations don't necessarily have the pro-housing policies in place to accommodate future folks who would, have the privilege and opportunity to move there. To be able to move is already an aspect of privilege. So those are, I think, many of the big ideas that we've heard about all day today and leave motivated to try to address. But to step back from the kind of policy and academic context, I'll be the third in the canon of panelists today to share a personal photo of climate impacts in my life. I live in Montpelier, Vermont, which is the capital, and Vermont's top of the list for these climate havens. But, this summer, we had not even a storm event, but a prolonged rainfall for 2 days. That was more rain in 2 days than usually seen around the month of July. And it devastated communities across the state, especially historic communities. Our downtown's at the confluence of two rivers. Not a coincidence there. And it, really knocked out the entire downtown. Seeing the high water line now, it is above, my 5-year-old's head by a couple hands. So that's a picture at left of, me being totally disgusting and dirty after a morning of volunteering, learning how these movie theater chairs are really connected and heavy and difficult to get out of a room. Because, many of us spend our days doing advocacy, I'll write my comment letters to the EPA and NOAA, but when this hits in your own community, like sometimes to make sense of it, you want to help your neighbors, you want to get out and just try to get dirty and do what you can to support. And, seeing that level of devastation, the first thing I saw, I just got directed to this movie theater from the downtown organization, was going with my son, his first movie ever, after we had not done that for like 2.5 years because of COVID. Talking to the movie theater owner, and what does she say? Oh, we were 5 days from Barbenheimer. It's not just a moment in time. Is what these events can do in 48 hours changes everything. So that's a challenge. How did we get here? I don't even think I have to really cover this because of everything that we have heard today. We are in an incredible housing access crisis in terms of lack of supply and lack of affordability. And then where we are seeing growth, it often coincides with areas with a reduced regulatory burden for new development. So, if you look at the time period after the pandemic, a significant amount of growth has occurred in Texas, the Southwest, Florida, locations where it may be easier to build, but where, in all likelihood, households may face more challenges in terms of flood risk, water supply, heat, etc. And then, as briefly chatted about already, many of the locations which are touting themselves as climate havens aren't necessarily ready to accommodate any potential new wave of people, let alone their own low and moderate income populations who are often feeling price pressures already. So what are the potential solutions here? Our panel was on our prep call discussing, it's not really easy to have the whole day of the challenge and then try to talk about the solutions in the last half an hour. So I think maybe instead we can talk about some goals first. For me, working in a smart growth organization, directing growth to locations that face reduced risk, where people can have more certainty. There's never total certainty, but more certainty and support in the event of climate events, which we will see, which we will experience more and with increasing intensity. And alongside that, supporting communities who are in harm's way, often on account of discriminatory policy, and supporting households to both have the homes and the resources that are needed and the social networks. And I think that has really come up all across the conversations today. So, there's a whole range of potential solutions. I think for any of these, they have to be adopted in combination with others. There is, like anything in land use and housing, there's no one strategy to accelerate housing supply. But what we're looking at are, first taking a climate-informed approach to zoning, looking at strategies for public-private partnerships. We heard earlier about ideas for reduced impact fees? How about transfer of development rights, a concept of like a TIF for climate adaptation? And then looking at what are the levers that could lead households to be able to make both investments in their own properties if they're homeowners, and strategies to be more prepared as a community like resilience hubs. A couple of examples that I can share from our work, both on a research and technical assistance basis. One is, I know many climate practitioners are already very familiar with the climate-informed approach to zoning in Norfolk, Virginia. I think this is it's the first citywide initiative to embed recognition of climate risk and vulnerability into zoning code. What I think is interesting here is, this approach essentially categorized the city by, if you think about a square with a high vulnerability, low vulnerability. Low vulnerability is obviously relative, given this is Norfolk, so there's extreme risk of sea level rise and subsidence issues. And then high current development and lower development. And sought to both direct development to locations which are at relatively less risk of future flooding, and sought to sort of prioritize infrastructure investment. Our team did a fiscal impact study of the impact after Vision 2100, the long-term plan, and the zoning changes came into effect from 2018 to 2021. And interestingly, this was, you go into one of these studies not knowing what you're going to find. It wasn't the world's most interesting headline. There was very little financial impact in terms of property valuation if you looked at it category by category. But for us, to see that at that time, it was kind of a beacon of hope in a way for the local government, talking to the city folks who had moved forward with this despite much opposition and fear that this would lead to significant property devaluation. And then to see that actually there was not that much of an immediate change. Again, Norfolk is unusual given the extent of federal government investment and a lot of the resilience investment from 100 Resilient Cities, National Disaster Resilience Competition, but we still found that to be a notable example to say, hey, a local government, put this out on paper, made this map, and still it was possible to kind of continue with development as normal to some degree. Finally, I'll wrap it up looking at the state level, thinking land uses, most of the levers which are most effective are at the local or state level, and I'll bring it back to Vermont since I started with the movie theater. Smart Growth America we did a consulting project with the state of Vermont looking at how their, they call it their designation program, could be used as both a pro-housing and climate adaptation tool. And this is a program which was designed to direct investment and economic development to historic centers. So, initially more about placemaking, more about creating, cores with a positive social value. And now 25 years later, they are looking at how can we direct more housing, because more housing is desperately needed, to areas here where you can live with less reliance on a car, and how can this program advance climate action, both by reducing reliance on driving and by encouraging adaptation. And the image on the top is of a building which of course took more than 10 years to get built. So back to the question about how does this all take so long? But I think it is a great example for a vulnerable site with a lot of social value and community connectivity. This is a transit center in Montpelier, which has 30 apartments, 20 affordable, 10 market rate above a transit hub. And this is right in the middle of the downtown, which experienced that level of flooding. And because the ground floor is the transit waiting area, which is much needed in a location with such cold winters, this was a use that did okay with some of the flood impacts. So essentially, this is brought a lot of great housing units to downtown for folks from a range of incomes, and it was designed to withstand an event, a 100-year event, which of course the community now sees every 10 years. There are a lot of ideas thinking about how a designation program could be used to advance climate adaptation, everything from incentivizing resilience hubs in these locations to supporting more of the business owners to work on resilience planning strategies via the downtown organizations rather than via, the faceless bureaucrat or the Zoom meeting. And then looking at strategies to increase use of climate data in making some of these boundary and planning decisions. So that is, two examples that came to mind, and I'm really excited for a dialogue amongst the panel and amongst the audience. It's been a really incredible discussion today, so thank you.
So I think we will take questions from the audience. And I think there are microphones moving around the room.
Hi, I have a question regarding the question of climate change versus environment. It seems to me that if you locate a residence along a seacoast where it's possible that the sea is going to rise up, or if you locate your residences on an area that has traditionally flooded, that I don't see, it's not clear to me why it's called climate and not simply an environmental issue, and why, in fact, you don't just relocate people away from an environment that's by nature hostile to residences.
Hi, I can take a first stab at that. I think first, the distinction is an important one, and I'll talk a little bit about my example in Louisiana in a moment. But I hear you, but if we can have an area that has historically flooded, I think what we see in many communities is as a result of deepening changes that are becoming more common and more intense. So to Katharine's point about the 100-year flood in Vermont, now people expect it to be every 10 years. So why is this happening? And to be using that language. Certainly in my work in Louisiana, in many of the coastal communities that I worked in, very conservative places, people who've lived in these communities for many years, very tied to the community, worked in fishing and shrimping, but they also worked in the oil and gas industry. People understood very well about the changes that were happening in their community and understood that something needed to be done and had been adapting for many years. And now we're getting to the point that they had to consider relocation. In working with these individuals, many people never talked about climate change, and it became a political issue, and they could understand very well that these environmental changes were happening and that they needed to address it to be more resilient, but not making, not using those phrases.
I guess I'll just try and answer the second part of your question too, which is why not just pay people to move? I mean, I think part of it's private land, right? So unless and people have the right to live in an area where they want to, that land is valued accordingly. So, what we find and what we know is that many affordable housing properties, for example, are in floodplains, are in more vulnerable areas because the land is cheaper. That's where the developers can make the deals work. It lowers the cost of land as a part of the, cost of developing housing. So you are inherently locating some types of buildings in areas that are already at greater risk, but the residents of those housing units don't necessarily have the freedom to just kind of pick up and move for lots of reasons. It's incredibly hard to secure affordable housing. Owners of affordable housing have put in years and years of work to get the affordable housing built. So it's not just as easy as kind of like putting up a for sale sign and relocating to a higher location. Specifically, I'm thinking about affordable housing developers. It's just so hard to get affordable housing built that to try and replicate those number of units in a safer and more secure area of land, it's just incredibly challenging right now. So I think that is where the public market comes in to buy out properties that are vulnerable. But again, that's a voluntary measure. People have to choose to sell. As we heard about before, there's a lot of distrust, a lot of concern. There's a lot of emotional tie to the land that keeps people from wanting to move. So it's not as easy as just sort of a flipping the switch and saying, we're not going to, no one can live here anymore, because these are private transactions at every step of the way.
And if I could just add one more point to that in terms of paying people to relocate. we spoke at great length in the prior panel. We heard a really great presentation about understanding risk from the perspective of financial institutions and housing markets. I think we also have to try to understand the perception of risk from people who are living in these situations. And certainly we need to do as much as we can so that people understand the climate risks that they're facing. But at the same time, folks that are weighing this in terms of the risk of moving and maybe losing their economic livelihood or losing those connections to their social networks. And certainly in the parts of coastal Louisiana where we see people moving, oftentimes, as I said, people understand the changes that they're facing, but the climate changes are just one of many risks that they face. And if they move, they're trying to weigh those different risks.
I think both of you covered that really well, but something I'll add just to bring it back to our overall theme of housing and climate is, again, like, as we look at having such a constrained market right now, like there's just not enough housing. So I see a first step as just improving the availability of housing in locations which are both less prone to climate impacts and are well served by transportation, well connected to community facilities and assets. And that, right now we don't even have that. And then you pile on top of that all the emotional costs of moving and all the other factors in any household's life. And I think for when there's not always data around where people do end up going if they take a buyout or do whatever else. But I think what we're often seeing on a local basis or an anecdotal basis is the only other places to potentially go in a high cost market may also be at risk. So it's we're not there's a lot of work to do here, I think.
The microphones are moving.
Do you see opportunities for collaboration with other fields within the built environment policy that can help support a solution?
Yeah. I mean, definitely. I think this whole symposium has been a showcase of that, how people have, come up here with everything from the financial, the technical, more energy-focused background to planning, community engagement. Like, I think these issues are so interconnected, we're not going to make any progress without trying to work together.
Hi. I think in your presentation you mentioned there is like a $7 million affordable homes right now that are deficient around the country. And then there's also a move for like inclusionary zoning, especially turning single-family homes to multi-family homes to actually create more affordable homes. How does that inclusionary zoning kind of match up with the climate-focused zoning? And how do they work together and cohesive together?
Start with that. I might pass to you, Danielle, too. I think that is a great question. It's another example of like the both and needing both approaches. I think first for some of the pro-housing interventions that you mentioned in terms of there's a movement nationally to make it easier to develop multifamily, to allow for accessory dwelling units or quads or duplexes by right. I think this is all positive in terms of increasing housing supply, but it doesn't necessarily immediately impact affordability. So I think having both the pro-housing interventions that are more market-focused and inclusionary zoning, which should preserve, frankly, not enough affordable housing, but it's a start, is really important. And yeah, so that's one quick thing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, thinking about if you're zoning for climate resilience, it has to include diversifying the housing supply, increasing the housing supply, certainly including more affordable units, but then also thinking about what are the sort of supportive services that go around that to ensure that that housing remains affordable? So to Katharine's earlier point, making sure that there's access to transit, access to walkable locations. It really is kind of that integrated approach that needs to be brought to climate resilience planning. Inclusionary zoning is part of it, but so are many, many other sort of policy levers that can be sort of accelerated to get to better outcomes.
I'll make one extra point too. Yeah, I'm having flashbacks around the flood now because I shouldn't have put the picture in the deck. But I felt grateful to live in a neighborhood with a mix of a lot of different housing types when everyone was really freaking out on like day 2 of this flood, where, you know, we had our really lovely elderly neighbor and, you know, living in the same building as the younger couple that didn't have young kids to deal with, so they had more bandwidth to make sure that folks could find what they needed and had a plan. And yeah, you know, you don't want it to come to that, but it's a positive, I think, to have, yeah, lots of units, housing units where people have different life circumstance together in one place when there is a difficult event. And that came back to the presentation earlier too around heat and you know, strategies to have communities well connected and supporting each other during a heat event.
Thank you so much. So I recognize that we're talking about policy, but as a former architect practitioner who has since moved away to study why architects contribute to inequality, I am wondering if in your thinking, you've considered, rather than adaptation or migration, but rather new forms. I'm thinking about, you know, Humudu stilt houses in China, right, that were an ancient technology to lift up away from the rice cultivation fields. And I know architects are working on this, but I'm curious, I have this question often, which is this really a policy issue? And I know we're talking a bit about interdisciplinarity. So in your work, how does that kind of intersect with design?
I don't think I can speak to that particular issue in terms of the sort of the stilted housing and sort of, I think we heard a little bit before about some of the traditional architecture being a solution, right, in terms of mitigating for heat, managing for all kinds of risks that have historically been there. I would say, I think that, you know, that just to underscore the point about right now we kind of we have one conventional building style, which is single family housing. I mean, that is overwhelmingly the majority of our stock. It's something like 85% of our stock is you know, large bedrooms as well, 2, 3, 4 more bedrooms, when we have a population that's like 50% of 1 or 2 person households. So there's a real mismatch in the kind of housing we're developing, not just how big it is, but also the degree that's attached or detached. I find a lot of inspiration right now in the zoning reform that's happening across the country. I'll give a shout out to my former employee, AARP, who I think has done a great job of sort of making the case that allowing for greater housing choice and housing diversity in a community is a strategy for helping communities to prepare for an aging community, right, for an aging population. So as to the question of architects, there's a ton of great solutions that architects are bringing online that can help make those accessory dwelling units or the multifamily conversions happen in ways that can streamline development, because as we've heard repeatedly, it takes so long and it's so difficult to get multifamily development through the pipeline. But there's so many single family homes that are sort of ripe for conversion and ripe for adaptation, and without encroaching upon undeveloped lands, by using infill opportunities, by building out, you know, in backyards and densifying communities. That there's so much creative opportunities there that I think architects play a big role in. One would hope that they're pulling on sort of, you know, traditional techniques and the like to inspire some of those designs. I think that was partially a little bit of what we saw in Katrina after the fact in terms of going back to the natural ventilation and things like that.
One more point to a perspective we haven't really heard from today's landscape architects. And I think looking at the change in thinking, like between Katrina and Sandy, I remember seeing after Superstorm Sandy, landscape architects really leading a lot of the design teams and thinking about interconnected ecological systems. And yeah, that's, I think, such an important piece of the puzzle that we haven't, yeah, I wish we had 2 days for this. I know that would be if we had another day.
Hi. These are great presentations, and I noticed that one of you focused mostly, Danielle, on a people-based approach. Katharine, you focused on a place-based approach. Yours was more of a synthesis, I think, Marla. I've been working on mapping potential receiving cities with the Congress for a New Urbanism, places that could be safe havens. It's a little harder than you might think. One of the conclusions we've reached is not only do you have to be housing development ready, but you have to make up for lost time on things like flooding and so forth, or it isn't really a haven. But I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned is while the stakes for a receiving city, if you will, might be apparent, sort of the opposite situation for cities that are losing population if you do the responsible thing. In other words, if you help people leave a place, I'll bet you can't find a mayor in the United States who's willing to lead that bandwagon. So how do we do that? I mean, and if you look historically, I mean, post-World War II, we sort of led a bandwagon out to the suburbs. And so we all have the usual list of subsidies and maybe some others, like paying critical industries to move 30 miles away from downtowns to avoid atomic war, allegedly. I mean, some pretty weird stuff. We're not close yet to policies, as far as I can tell, to actually help be honest about this situation. So the default is to help one person at a time, to say who wants to move and counsel them and try and knit these programs together. Is there a planning framework that we should be talking about that actually puts this proposition on the table? I mean, Katharine, you seem to have a framework for who the best practitioners are on at least thinking about planning for resilience, but don't we need to actually work to not just make it random access, let's see who's ready to move, and what have you? How do we do that? I mean, the emergency response systems that we have, by definition, say, let's wait for the next bad thing to happen and then see how quickly we can move. And whereas we know there's going to be trouble now, don't we need a policy? I don't see a single thing, by the way, in either the bipartisan infrastructure law or the IRA or the CHIPS and Science Act. Carlos, maybe you know, there is one? Okay, that's good. That gives me hope. I'll learn something today. But how do you think about this issue? Because it seems that's part of what's on the table here. If we're stuck with random access, one person's choice at a time, I don't see this converging on a set of adequate solutions. So how do we make this more effective, impactful?
And that's a fantastic question, and I look forward to the information that Carlos is going to give us about where it is in whatever act. And so I can't speak necessarily to a particular framework like the framework that Katharine spoke to, but you're certainly right. This is a hard issue in that you don't have many mayors or council members where you can have a buyout program who are going to support it. And certainly in Louisiana, we could have, in some places, community support for relocation efforts, and you'd have elected leaders saying, no, it's fine, this isn't a threat. And it's a real issue. I was really struck, Katharine, by the fiscal impact analysis that you did for Norfolk, and you found, hey, you know, we thought that there was going to be this real negative impact, and there wasn't. And unless we get to the point in which we're having massive buyouts, some of the loss of property tax revenue to communities might be actually quite small. And then also with that, there have been some initiatives, you know, I'll default to the need for planning, not just about, you know, where people move, but planning about what we do with those properties that are left behind. And so you have community members who don't want to participate in a relocation program because they don't know what's involved. And you have local officials that don't want to participate because they don't want to be on the hook for maintenance. But there have been efforts at natural-based solutions to say, okay, we're going to use properties to, you know, feed into our stormwater management in a way that isn't going to be too burdensome to communities. But longer term, if we're thinking this on a bigger scale, we need to think about federal incentives for this and, types of regional governance. I know that's not too helpful right now, but